DeepCool CH560 digital, available in white or black, £105 here in the UK. You get three 140mm RGB fans at the front and a 120mm RGB fan at the rear. The digital part, that's this display, which is on show through a window in the hybrid side panel. DeepCool CH560 is available in two colours, black and white, and two forms, the regular or base model and the digital. This is the digital, so we have this little window here, and behind this hybrid side panel, which is magnetically retained, we have an LCD, which we'll come to later. The hybrid side panel is interesting, so it's a combination of glass and mesh. Behind the hybrid side panel we have the LCD and a fixed power supply shroud, which has loads of cutouts. It's not exactly mesh, it's a grid perforation. Around the back we have the same patterning, and of course at the front panel, bit of a pull and away it comes. We've got quite a lot of potential for airflow at the sides, and we have a DeepCool logo on the top. Three 140 fans, they are PWM controlled and RGB. The same is true of the 120mm fan at the rear. The right hand side panel is very conventional, it's solid. Two thumb screws, no noise deadening material, not a lot to say about that. Behind that side panel we can see the daisy chained cabling for those fans. That is somewhat messy, obviously it's out of sight. On the top we have a magnetically retained dust filter. The fixed top panel has the same grid pattern for airflow, and we can install two 140s or three 120 fans. You can see the front I/O is on the top. We have an RGB control button, one USB-A, headset jack, USB-C. Moving to the bottom of the case, we have a filter for the intake for the power supply fan. It's very basic and not quite as convenient as a regular slide out filter. In front of the power supply we have a single drive cage. We can install a 3.5-inch hard drive. Once you've removed the drive cage from the case, you have a number of options. Sadly, you do have to remove the cage from the case to work with it. For starters, we can install a hard drive on top of the cage. Worth pointing out, these two Seagate drives have a hole pattern that is partly incompatible with the cage. We have four female threads in the bottom of the drive and we have four holes in the cage, but they don't align. So I can only install this drive using two of the threads, and that's really not acceptable. Other drives have different hole patterns, so that with these Seagates is an issue. What I can do, however, is to take a 2.5-inch SATA SSD, install that on top of the drive cage without any difficulty whatsoever, and then I can install a hard drive in the cage. And then the whole assembly goes back in the case. This to me is the kind of procedure you want to go through when you're building a PC. You don't really want to be modifying a built PC like this, although clearly it is possible. On the back of the motherboard tray we have some pre-installed grommets. Take a 2TB SSD, plug it in like so. Take a second SSD, run in these little pegs, and we can resort frankly to using two rather than four because the drive weighs next to nothing and has no moving parts and no vibration. When you consider this hard drive 16TB and this is 10, and those SSDs are each 2TB, add in some M.2 storage, realistically you've got many options, but it is a slight shame we don't have a couple more mounting holes in the drive cage. They've made a reasonable effort at cable management, bearing in mind we have a solid back panel so everything's hidden away anyway from this side. We have a channel, we have Velcro straps, that's all good. The SATA connection is for the RGB lighting. If you don't want to use the built-in hardware function and you're going to connect directly to your motherboard header, you don't connect that, you just go directly to your motherboard software. Apart from the styling aesthetic with this grid pattern rather than regular mesh, it's this LCD display, the part that gives this case the digital name, which is the unusual feature. And we have an enormously long USB cable, not quite sure why it's so long. So this cable connects to your motherboard, and then we install some DeepCool software I have not personally experienced yet, and then that display will give us the ability to monitor CPU speed and CPU temperature. In other words, it's coming out of system info, or at least that's what DeepCool's information says. And now let's get on and put some hardware inside and see exactly what it can accommodate. Starting with the motherboard, I've installed this Gigabyte Z790 Aorus Master X, which is E80X. This case supports E80X, and when I stick my fingers through the cable management grommets, you can see it all lines up very nicely. While the Aorus Master X works well enough, I'm going to revert to the Gigabyte Z790 Aorus Pro X, which is an ATX board that I used recently in a Sharkoon review, because this board is white in colour and I think it'll look more aesthetically pleasing. So let's swap out the motherboards and see which of the two installations we prefer. And here we go, switching from the Z790 Aorus Master X to the Z790 Aorus Pro X. Personally, I think the ATX works better, and I love it in white. CPU is an Intel Core i7-14700K. And we're going to go with some G.Skill Trident Z5 RGB DDR5 memory, rated at 6000 megatransfers. For the power supply, I'm sticking with my current fave, which is the Seasonic Focus GX1000 Gold, rated at 1000 watts. Fully modular, and it's ATX 3.0, which means it supports the current crop of RTX 40 series graphics cards. With the cables connected, we slide the power supply into place and lock it down. These are the cables that are part of the case for USB audio and such like. Plenty of space there in front of the power supply and behind the drive housing. Let's get this connected up. With the cables connected up and tidied away, we're moving on to the CPU cooler, which is this NZXT Kraken Elite 360 RGB. You can install either a 280 or a 360mm cooler in the front or the roof of this case, and as you can see, I've chosen a 360. But we have 3140 fans in the front, and that would sound to be incompatible with a 360 cooler. So do I have to remove those fans if I wish to put a 360 cooler behind them? Or is there some clever trick? Yes, there is the short answer there. Let's take a closer look. We remove 4 screws and that front fan rack swings away. And I could, if I choose, install a 360 cooler either with or without fans on the cooler itself. Those 3140s would, after all, you'd expect, blow plenty of air through the radiator, so I could take these fans, put them in the roof. That strikes me as giving you many options. I'm going to take the alternative approach and install this 360 cooler in the roof of the case, because I think that's what most people will prefer to do. That way we don't have to touch the front fans, install the cooler, and basically the PC is pretty much finished, apart of course from the graphics card. We apply some Arctic MX4 thermal compound to the Core i7, install the cooler, and then we're ready for the graphics card. Our chosen graphics card is this enormous Gigabyte GeForce RTX 4080 Gaming OC. DeepCool tells us their CH560 can accommodate the largest components, and it's only right and proper that we put that to the test. And look, here's the result, and DeepCool is quite correct. So the next step is to start up our new PC. The test PC is running and the RGB lighting is all controlled by the motherboard. We've switched off the hardware control functions. The RGB lighting looks absolutely fine, but it has to be said, it does look rather better with the lights off. And with that important point out of the way, it's time to do some thermal testing. We're hammering the hardware with a combination of Cinebench R23 to stress the CPU and Speedway stress test to load the graphics card. We're drawing between 760 and 780 watts at the wall socket, of which 275 watts is going to the processor and 330 watts to the graphics card. This is a serious test. For our first test run, we set all the fans 800 RPM. That's 3 fans on the AIO, the 3 fans at the front of the case, and 1 fan at the rear of the case. And it sounded like this. Nice and quiet, however the cooling is not so great. Our Intel Core i7-14700K was running the P cores at 5.4 GHz and the temperature is 100 degrees. The graphics on the other hand, nice and cool at 67 degrees. For the second test we ramped all the fans up to 1100 RPM. That is maximum speed for the 140mm case fans. There's still some headroom for the AIO fans and for the rear case fan. At 1100 RPM, the system sounded like this. And the consequence of the extra cooling is the processor is now running at 5.5 GHz rather than 5.4 GHz, and the temperature has dropped to 96 degrees. GPU temperature slightly cooler at 65 degrees. For the third test we ran all the fans at maximum speed. So the 3 AIO fans at 1800 RPM, the 3 140mm fans at 1100 RPM and the 120mm case fan at 1200 RPM. And it sounded like this. Clearly that's rather loud, however the extra fan speed and airflow made very little difference to the cooling. CPU still running at 5.5 GHz, temperature now 95 degrees and the graphics card stable at 65 degrees. And that brings us to my concluding thoughts about this DeepCool CH560 digital. Pros, the good points. The case is supplied with 3 140mm PWM ARGB fans at the front and a 120mm fan at the rear. It's got smart styling, and I must confess I rather like this hybrid side panel, which is a combination of glass and mesh. The LCD display, which I have barely mentioned in this review, it's a nice touch. As you can see, it's displaying system information. It's clearly cost very little. The non-digital version in this case is about £10 cheaper, so that display technically it's rather basic. It uses USB control for the software and it's a nice touch at such a low price. The front fan rack allows you to install a 360mm cooler behind those 140mm fans. I like that aspect quite a lot. And finally, it has a reasonably low price, both for white and black. Cons, the negative points. The RGB lighting is rather basic. Frankly, it's exactly what I'd expect for a case at this price point, but it does only have a few LEDs in each of the fan hubs. Installing a 3.5-inch hard drive or 2 3.5-inch hard drives requires you to remove the hard drive cage, and that in turn means you're going to have to lay the PC on its side to get to the screws on the bottom of the case. Finally, installing a 360mm AIO cooler in the roof of the case, as I have done, is a close fit. Both with the rear fan, I found that. Also, if your memory is tall, that might impinge as well. It's doable, but it is close. Overall, the CH560 Digital is a decent case and it's worth buying.